Okay, so the first lecture on media and politics talked about, the nature of mass media and media events, things like that. Let's talk a little bit about the development and the history of media politics over time, okay? And there are different places you could begin, obviously. You could begin all the way back in colonial times with newspapers. If we talk a little bit more recently about audiovisual media, okay, there's a good contrast between Herbert Hoover, who said the president of the United States will not stand to be questioned like a chicken thief by men whose names he does not even know. So he basically refused to do a press conference, refused to do any real interaction with the media. Compare that to Franklin Roosevelt, who pioneered the press conference. Other presidents had used it before him. I think Woodrow Wilson maybe did the first press conference, but Wilson is somewhat rigid, not, for lack of a better word, pompous person, not really given to certainly not given to pioneering the press conference and making it a natural, fluid type of experience for anybody. Franklin Roosevelt really was the one who started to change the relationship between the president and the media. Again, with these things, you can often look back and see somebody who was a bit of a precursor or somebody who started to do something. Roosevelt or whoever didn't change things completely out of nowhere. But FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, really started using the press conference. He had two a week, over 1,000 during his presidency. Of course, he was elected 4 times. And he used the fireside chat, and that was a radio address, usually weekly, that would go out to people. And, it was a little bit more informal. It was a little bit less of a press conference where he's being asked questions by journalists and responding and trying to explain to reporters policy and things like that. It was more of a way to connect directly with people during the Great Depression and reassure them that things were going well and that things are going to get better, okay? So that radio, obviously, in 2021, the radio might seem like very old technology, but again, think about for the first time, being able to sit in your living room and turn on the radio and hear the voice of the president seeming to speak to you directly, because that was what was so effective about the fireside chats, is that connection that Roosevelt was able to create with the people who were listening. And again, it was a very new media, and it was very kind of revolutionary that you could actually hear somebody's voice in your own home, right? And so it was really kind of made this very strong connection between Roosevelt and the people listening. I won't try to play any here in this video, but you can find them online. You can listen. You can hear what they sounded like. So on the one hand, he used the official media, the journalists, the reporters, to get his story out, right, rather than sort of thinking that he was above talking to them like Hoover and that he was sort of too exalted to answer their questions. He understood, that's part of how people understand. That's, again, part of the role that the media is supposed to play. They're supposed to be reporting on policy and what's happening and why things are happening this way. Tell them your side of the story. Don't leave it to them to piece together themselves. Go ahead, tell them the story, get your ideas out there that way. He also used the fireside chat, then those radio addresses that were much more personal and connected with people, okay? And these two things are what really started to change, in some ways, media politics, especially for the president, and in a way, especially that fireside chat, as we talked about with the imperial presidency. This is, and again, it's gradual. It didn't happen on, a particular day or even a particular year, but you start to have the president as an individual start to loom much larger in American politics than any other individual, okay? Over time, okay, after World War II, there's a lot of deference, okay? There's a lot of respect on the part of the media who think that presidents and the government generally are doing their best and that they're trying to do what's good for the country, and that there are serious enemies, the Soviet Union, communists, etc. So there tends to be a fairly deferential, respectful reporting on these things. And you may know that the media never mentioned that Franklin Roosevelt was in a wheelchair because of polio, because they were worried that people would be afraid that he was weak, or that he was in poor health, that he wouldn't be able to finish leading the country through the Depression or World War II. Didn't really, there were signs that they knew that John F. Kennedy was having extramarital affairs. They didn't report on any of that. The real turning point here was Vietnam and Watergate, okay? And we've talked about this before. Vietnam, the Pentagon Papers finding out that both the civilian and the military leadership were consciously lying to the public about how well the Vietnam War was going. That there was an intentional and concerted effort to mislead the public about the Vietnam War and about whether or not it was going according to plan, and whether the people who were running it, again, both the military and the civilian, whether they thought it was successful or even winnable, okay? When people found that out, and then shortly after that, Watergate happens, when they find out again that Nixon had engaged in this elaborate cover-up involving all sorts of illegal activity on his part, all sorts of illegal actions, these two things really shook people, and they really made them think that they could no longer have that deferential, respectful attitude towards people in authority. And that's when a more adversarial, a more cynical, questioning, challenging, generally adversarial attitude emerged among the media generally, as the assumption became, we can't trust that they're doing the right thing. We can't trust their goodwill or their public virtue or anything like that. We need to go ahead and be a little bit more adversarial, force them to defend themselves, assume that maybe they're lying, that something is not right here. Okay, so that there's the generational change, right? This is when the baby boomers are coming of age. You have the Vietnam War, which was unpopular generally. There was a big generational rift. Now, to some extent, the anti-war hippie part of that generation got a lot of attention. When Nixon ran and talked about the silent majority, part of his point was that too much attention is being given to a group of people who really don't represent the country as a whole. So you don't want to overstate it and say that every single person was, every single baby boomer was, an anti-war protester or whatever. But you have a lot of different things happening in this period of the late 60s, early 70s that change American society in a lot of very deep, fundamental ways, and very long-term, probably permanently, okay? Vietnam and Watergate, and the way that they shook the public's trust in these authority figures and in these institutions, whether it's the military or the government, really changed things, okay? And that was really kind of a turning point in a lot of aspects of American society and politics, and certainly in the way that the media treated elected officials. Okay, reporting the news. Okay, a couple of terms for you to use that might be useful. Okay, trial balloon. So a leak, a news leak, is when somebody in a campaign or in the government or whatever intentionally leaks something, meaning that they say something that's supposed to be secret. Okay, that isn't supposed to go out to the press and become public. Why would they do that? They might have their own reasons, right? They may want to embarrass somebody in the government. They may want to, they might have all kinds of reasons why they're trying to manage things or push a particular outcome in the government, and they think that leaking information to the press will help with that. It may just be that they're sort of vain and that they like turning on the television and seeing a bunch of reporters going crazy about this news story that they leaked, right? It could be as simple as that sometimes. But a trial balloon is when there's an intentional news leak to see how the public, or maybe the politician's supporters, their real party and the base of their party, will react to that. So a news leak is when information is given to the media that isn't supposed to become public, okay? Sometimes it's done, it's always done intentionally, but sometimes it's done, by an actor within the government or within a campaign. A trial balloon is an intentional leak, which is kind of presented as if it's a leak. And then people stand back, the people who leak it or who authorize the leak. I mean, they don't tell journalists that it's necessarily an intentional leak, but they stand back and they gauge the reaction. How do our supporters, how do our voters, how do our party members, how does the public as a whole, how do they react to this? And if it's intensely negative, then they'll come out and say, well, that was just a leak. We were never going to do that. I don't know where this story came from. If it turns out that people are okay with something that they thought might be difficult or controversial, they might come back and say, okay, we're going to go through and do it. Okay, so a trial balloon is an intentional leak to see and to gauge the reaction. Okay, a soundbite, a short video clip from a speech. This is more of an issue or more something you see maybe on television, but you can obviously see it on the internet, YouTube, short video clips being shared on social media, right? A soundbite is a short clip from a much longer speech. Okay, often you have somewhat complicated, although of course the rhetoric is often laid on very thick, especially in campaign speeches. But you have somewhat more elaborate discussions of things that are often boiled down then into one or two sentences, okay? So the soundbite is obviously somewhat misleading, and of course they sometimes even write speeches just to get to the soundbite, okay? That can be, in the old days, shown on the evening news, now maybe shared on social media, okay? And probably the major change in reporting the news is the drive for profit, okay? The emergence of the 24/7 news cycle, first of all, with cable news. Okay, and cable news represented a shift from the old days where you had newspapers that were largely supported by advertising, okay, but had a fair amount of editorial independence. And then you had the network news, which was like a half an hour in the evening, okay? And the major networks who ran those evening news broadcasts, they weren't trying to make money off of them. In fact, they didn't expect them to make money. They did it out of a sense of public obligation, and they did it because they wanted to do a little bit more with their lives than just show game shows and soap operas and, you know, maybe football games. So they were kind of, it was more of a prestige thing to some extent, and also a public service thing. So they never expected the evening news to make money. Once you switch to a 24/7 news, cable news model, that has to make money. That's all that there is. It's not going to make money off of daytime programming or, you know, sitcoms in prime time or anything like that. The only way it's going to make money off of is off of the news. So it starts to present the news in more entertaining ways, which often means in more sensationalist ways. And a lot of people point to the O.J. Simpson trial. The Cold War was over. CNN was kind of just coming on the scene. And really this kind of long, drawn out, sensationalized reporting on this thing that really wasn't that important and was really not a major issue of public concern, okay? It may have resonated with other issues in society, but the amount of time that was spent analyzing different jurors and different statements that were made in court during the O.J. Simpson trial, and the amount of breathless reporting that got on CNN, some people look back and see that as something of a turning point towards the idea of news as being entertaining and also sensationalist, okay? And a lot of this carries over into the internet, where the drive is for clicks, okay? How do you get somebody to click on this story and then hopefully click on the ad, because the ad is all the ad revenue is coming from the internet now. But people don't really subscribe. I mean, people do sometimes still subscribe to online publications, but they don't necessarily subscribe the way they did in the old days when the newspaper comes to your house and you read the ads that are in the newspaper. You have to click on something that you see on social media or that you see wherever, and then maybe click on an ad. Okay, so of course you have the clickbait headline, right? A headline that is written in a way that's supposed to be outrageous or intriguing or shocking or something to get you to click on it, right? So this drive for profit, the way that reporting the news becomes something that is either crafted to get revenue and money, like with cable news back in the 90s when it was still relatively new, the early aughts when it was sort of just didn't necessarily have to exist, but was there trying to get money. And now with the internet, where print publications are largely reliant on online ad revenue, which they kind of have to get by again appealing in this massive online marketplace where there's so many people making noise over so many different things. How do you get them to pay attention to you? How do you get them to click on this story? Oftentimes it's done again through these clickbait headlines, topics, whatever. Okay, so the drive for profit, sometimes the drive for profit, sometimes just the press of necessity to stay in business by making a little bit of money is really shapes the way that the news is reported. Okay, this is a chart from the Ad Fontes Media Company. There are kind of different things like this. You can find it online. You can look at more recent versions. Okay, the key point here is not necessarily where this or that publication ends up. The key point is you have neutral, is that a lot of news outlets are trying to report the news in a fairly straightforward way. Okay, the media sometimes gets, criticized where there's conspiracy theories or oftentimes exaggerated criticisms of how they're trying to manipulate things. Okay, a lot of news is just trying to report what happens. Inevitably, you have to make choices about what you're going to talk about and what you're not, who you're going to interview or who you're going to quote and take seriously and who you're not. So there is some selection and some shaping of the story in that way, which is necessary, okay? What you get into eventually is more opinion type of reporting, more news and writing and maybe, stuff on YouTube or, television or whatever that is really meant more to convince people of something. It's less about informing them and more about convincing them of something. And that's fine as long as you understand that that's what you're looking at, okay? If you are reading something that is meant to convince you of something, that is meant to lead you to a particular conclusion, and you think you're seeing an objective, straightforward report on something, it can be confusing and you can come away with the wrong idea, right? You can think that you've just seen an objective report on something when in fact what you've seen is an argument to try to get you to conclude something, okay? And that's not wrong, it's just you need to understand which is which, okay? And of course, sometimes there are things that are not really an argument. They really are purposely skewing things, like Fox News that is trying to mislead people and trying to put out misinformation, okay? And then you also have just sensationalist stuff like CNN that is not really doing a good job of informing people because they have two idiots yelling at each other, right? Again, it's sort of a very bad form of the news as entertainment, but it's out there, and that's happening where it's not necessarily that they're trying to get you to conclude something. They're trying to get you to keep watching, and doing it by presenting a very dumbed down, sensationalized version of the news that often is very, very short on any kind of actual content, okay? But also, you do have the fake news. You do have people just putting out things that aren't true or things that are extremely dishonest. But within the realm of serious, respectable news, there's a lot of room between just the facts and just trying to report what happened and making an argument about what people should believe, okay? And all of that can be legitimate, and all of that can be serious and responsible. You just want to be clear what you're looking at. Are you looking at something that's just trying to inform you of what happened, or are you looking at something that's trying to present an argument and convince you of something? Okay? This is from your textbook. It's a good thing. Another issue, conglomerates, the number of companies that own many, many media companies across the country. Okay? 1983, you see 90% of media was owned by 50 different companies. In 2019, 90% was owned by 6 different companies. So obviously, when ownership of media outlets, news channels, newspapers, when they're controlled by just a handful of corporations, obviously there can be a lot of control over what these people are saying, over what the individual media companies are saying. Because, again, you might think you have a dozen different news companies and you have some measure of diversity and some measure of autonomy and whatever, but in reality, they're all owned by Comcast, or they're all owned by Disney, and they all report to that same person. So if ultimately that same person and that same board of directors and whatever. So if they want to push a particular view on that, they can, and it's not always clear that that's happening, right? But conglomeration, the ownership of more and more media outlets by fewer and fewer people and fewer corporations. Another issue with the media and the way that it has developed, especially since the 1990s into the 21st century, okay? Media and public opinion, I've said this a few times, the media is not so much trying to tell you, Barack Obama is good, John McCain is bad. What they can do is focus on particular issues which inevitably favor one candidate over the other, okay? 1992, a lot of focus on the recession, which, was understandable. It was difficult for a lot of people. Not so much focus on low inflation, okay? And previously at times you would have a recession, slow economic growth, and an increase in inflation. So it was, the recession was reported on as a very negative thing, which again, for most people it was. It's not like that was a strange or a sinister thing that they did, but there was very little discussion of the fact that there was low inflation, okay? So that maybe made it more difficult for George H.W. Bush. But again, it was more his own inability, as we've talked about, his own inability to connect with voters and to relate to people who were struggling with the recession, much more than it was anything that the media did, okay? 2000, Al Gore was running. He had been Bill Clinton's vice president. There was a lot of discussion of Bill Clinton's bad character and a lot of discussion of, are voters going to blame Al Gore for this and vote against him? Relatively little discussion of the amazing economy that Clinton and Gore had overseen in the 1990s. Really probably one of the best, if not the best economy, depending on how you're measuring best economy, but a really amazing period of economic growth, prosperity, peace for the United States generally, okay? So there was much more focus on Bill Clinton's lousy character and his bad actions as president, especially with Monica Lewinsky and other things that had come out about him, rather than the extremely strong economy and the prosperity and the general security of the United States, the world in the 1990s. So that obviously hurt Al Gore, right? The more that you focus on what a sleazeball Bill Clinton is, and are people going to associate Al Gore with that, and are they tired of this, rather than can you believe this economy, that's something that is going to benefit one candidate or the other, not because they're trying to get you to vote for this guy or because they're telling you, Joe is good, Bob is bad, but because the subjects that they focus on sometimes really advantage one candidate or another. So in other words, the media helps set the policy agenda, okay? And, the policy agenda can somewhat, that's basically the list, the things that people are taking seriously. especially people who are, the policy issues that people are seriously concerned with right now, especially obviously public officials, people who actually know what's going on with government and have some influence over that, okay? Smaller, less powerful groups can kind of, we go back to that idea of political theater. They can seize attention and direct attention to something if they do things in a particularly dramatic way. However, again, with that 24 news cycle, whether we're talking about cable news or the internet, people's memory is so short and people are on to the next dramatic but very superficially comprehended thing so quickly that in some ways this is much more difficult than it was in, say, the 1980s, okay? So that's the media, some of the things that they're doing, the history of the relation, a very brief, very selective history of the relationship between the media and politics, the way that it's developed, and some discussion about what the media is doing, what they're not doing, how they may or may not be influencing people.